And in Winning the Race, the chapter on the inner city, you write, crack in 1985 was cheap enough, but still cost enough to ruin a life. Heroin in 1945 cost a lot more than bubblegum, but not so much more that anyone interested could not get some on a regular basis. That is, poor blacks knew drugs coming in long, long before the early 80s. The question is why drugs coming in hooked every second person in poor black communities only after the 60s.
What I said. Yeah, because a lot of people's answer is, well, drugs came in. And of course, if you were there on the ground, that is the change that you notice. But one tries to be a, in my case, junior social scientist about this sort of thing. But why then? Drugs, were around, and okay, crack is, there's a certain cheapness about crack, but if it's such a natural decision to devote your life to selling it instead of getting some sort of legal job, especially, why isn't it that happened among people of all classes all throughout society? There was a time, I think, when that would have been something that a few gangsters would have done. But the notion that it's better and cooler and natural to do that, I think, was because this was in neighborhoods where already there was a whole generation of kids who had been raised under a whole different set of assumptions. And I think this had started in the 60s, and that the whole sense of what work meant and whether or not work was optional had a lot to do with this. It's interesting. All of a sudden, you had a group of black young men, and it would be the smarter ones who would decide to try to build a drug empire. Smart black young men for whom it's just normal to not take a legal job. And maybe you drift in and out, but still, that's just normal. Whereas in 50 years before, you certainly had your thugs, but not as many. Many people, I think, would benefit from reading, for example, Richard Wright's description of Bronzeville, Black Chicago. And he talks about it, warts and all. There were thugs. It wasn't the norm that it was later. And there could have been more thugs. And so I think that there was a cultural change. And I think that thinking it was just drugs is an oversimplification, although, given the fact that however we feel about it, drugs ended up becoming a mainstay black market economy, I have argued a lot lately that I think the war on drugs needs to be stopped, and I don't mean just against marijuana. I don't think that it needs to be changed. I think that if we set up a system where for people who wanted to use hard drugs, you could go get it at some store cheap. And I admit that there might be problems with increased addiction, although I think there's evidence that it wouldn't be as much as people think. If that happened, you'd pull the legs out from under that whole economy. We don't need to moralize about why people are benefiting from it and engaging in it. Just pull it out. You couldn't make any kind of big money. You wouldn't have any hope of making any kind of big money selling crack on the street. And suddenly I think we'd see a wonderful thing, and I see this potential in all of the people in question. Those guys would go get jobs. And they'd get jobs, and they keep the jobs because they wanted to eat. And suddenly we'd see the kind of revolution that I think a lot of people seem to think is going to come from some sort of financial Marshall Plan from D.C., which shows no signs of happening, and I don't think would address the real problems. So, no war on drugs is one view of, right-wing, rabid, conservative me.